the Egyptians were pretty gross, especially when it came to the parts we don't usually talk about. We all know Egypt as one of the ancient world's great civilizations, the land of the pharaohs, the great pyramids of Giza, Tutankhamun and Cleopatra. But what you might not know is that a lot of the things they got up to are pretty gross, especially when it came to their nether regions. So, in this video, we'll cover 5 gross things the ancient Egyptians thought about what happens down there. And fair warning, they get progressively worse. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine that you're an Egyptian woman living 3,500 years ago. It wasn't a bad time to be a woman. For the most part, you had all the same rights as men. You could represent yourself in court, run your own business, leave your possessions to whoever you wanted in your will, and if your marriage broke up, you got to keep everything you brought into the marriage, plus 1/3 of anything your husband shared with you. And yes, I realise that's not 50-50, but the thinking was, as the man had to pay the woman a hefty dowry when they got together, she got to keep that as hers, and 1/3 then made it kind of fair. That's better than many ancient cultures. In fact, it's better than most cultures, including our own, until far too recently. Some researchers also think that women had the same access to education as men most of the time, the clue being that there was a goddess of writing, Seshat, as well as the god, Thoth. We also know that Egyptian women could go into medicine, and you'd be surprised how advanced Egyptian medicine could be. They could detect cancer and diabetes, had an impressive knowledge of plant-based medicines, and an understanding of anatomy thousands of years ahead of its time, as well as remarkable skills in dentistry and gynecology. If you're an Egyptian lady, you might one day get introduced to a strapping young Egyptian man by your family. They might want you to marry him so your two families can become closer, and luckily, he's a pretty nice guy with a ripped physique and some impressive golden headgear, a bit like the ones you see in the movies. So, you decide to sign a prenup, which they did quite often, accept his dowry and move in with him, which back then was all you needed to do to be officially hitched and start a family. Not that you needed to be married to do that. The Egyptians didn't have a problem with children born outside marriage because, to them, marriage wasn't about kids. It was about bringing families, power and wealth together. Then, one warm night, you get together and, well, do the business. We don't know much about what went on in the bedroom because the ancient Egyptians never wrote about it. But we do know from images that they weren't exactly shy. Then, one day, you realise you haven't had your time of the month for a little while. Your husband is still having his, we'll get to that a bit later, but you've missed yours. So, you need to know if you're pregnant. But how do you do that when you won't have a stick to pee on for 5,000 years? The answer is simple. Pee on something else. This is a papyrus from the Carlsberg collection at the University of Copenhagen. It tells us tons about Egyptian medicine, including how they did their pregnancy test. So, there you are, suspected that you might be pregnant, and you go to your doctor, or Sunu, and he comes in with 2 bags. One, there's wheat, in the other, there's barley. All you have to do is pee on them both and wait. If the urine-soaked barley sprouts first, you're having a boy. If it's the wheat, a girl. If neither, you're not pregnant. Now, peeing on a future dinner, we don't know if they had to eat it or not, but stranger things have happened, might seem gross, but modern pregnancy tests measures HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin, that's given off by embryos. What the Egyptians were looking for, though they didn't realise it, was a rise in estrogen. Usually when you pee on wheat or barley seeds, you kill them, you stop them from growing, but tests have shown that if your estrogen levels are high, they grow just fine 70% of the time. So, it wasn't so strange after all, even if it is a bit gross. But that's after you thought you were pregnant. What if you wanted to avoid it altogether? Well, that was a little grosser. Access to contraception has, it's fair to say, changed the world. It's given women the ability to delay when they have children and has opened a window into sexual freedom and career advancement that was all but shut in times gone by. But the desire for that freedom isn't a new thing. In ancient Egypt, many women were business owners, even powerful officials, and they wanted to put pregnancy off for as long as they could. Of course, they could abstain, but as we've said, the ancient Egyptians were quite liberal in their attitudes to getting it on, so maybe not. What was the alternative? Well, your doctor would tell you to find honey from bees that fed on acacia flowers, and some of the acacia flowers themselves, which sounds good and nice and clean, perhaps a delicious syrup you eat to keep the body from conceiving. Well, no. What you do is turn the acacia and honey into fermented plant gunk, as the papyrus Kahun from 1850 BCE describes it, and then get hold of some crocodile dung. Then you pound that together and then insert the gunk poo mixture, use your imagination. You then need to keep it up there before and after you've done the deed to make sure. What that did for the mood is anyone's guess. Maybe some of them liked it, or maybe it worked because no one would go near you. It might have worked because it did work. More recent studies have shown that crocodile poop could work as a barrier and even a spermicide, neutralising the little swimmers before they get a chance to fertilise an egg. So, just like the pregnancy test, maybe it wasn't so strange after all, even though it was gross. But it wasn't just the front parts the Egyptians were gross about. They also had a bit of an obsession with the back end. Ea-en-Akhete, or Iri as it was better known, had worked hard to get to the top of the ancient Egyptian medical profession. Now he was in the presence of his pharaoh, not only his king, but his god. It was the 6th dynasty, and the belief back then was that all the body's air and fluids, breath, urine, blood, waste, so on, flowed through 22 metu, or channels, that began at the heart and ended close to the backside where they could exit. They thought that everything that could cause death, from injury to disease to aging itself, happened because of a poison called wakhedu, which formed in the intestines and was built up if one or more of the channels was ruptured or blocked. So, as a medical professional, you'd specialise in treating one of these channels. Iri was the lucky one. He got to treat the spot where the channels came together, for he was the Amu Mekhenua Netetet, the shepherd of the anus, or the keeper of the ring's rectum, or it could be translated as the guardian of the royal bowel movement. His job was to ensure that all those liquids could get out how they were supposed to, and that none of that poison accumulated at the exit. He had a few ways of doing that. One was to make a medicine out of honey, a plant-based medicine, and a range of liquids from plain water to milk, beer or wine. This is where I normally try to lead you on by suggesting that the pharaoh would drink this lovely medicine to clear him out. But by now, you know where this is going. Right up his arse, Iri would take a golden cannula, insert it into his god emperor's darkest hole, and then use the medicine to clear any blockages. The lucky guy, and he did believe he was fortunate to hold such a prestigious position, would do it 3 times a month. Unlike the first 2 gross things, this doesn't have any real medical benefits, unless you want your farts to smell like beer, that is. That wasn't his only job. He did have a few other duties. One is linked to that male period I told you about earlier that I'll get to later. Just wait for that one. The other, and the one we'll look at next, was something he might have had to help with after the pharaoh passed on. We need a little background to understand the weird things they did to King Tutankhamun's body. King Tut was the son of Akhenaten, who ruled from roughly 1353 to 1335 BCE. His dad was a controversial figure, starting his own religion that made the sun disk, Aten, the one true god. He began getting rid of the old gods, and he especially hated the old chief deity, Amun. He built a brand new capital city dedicated to the new god and called that city Amarna. He was so dedicated to his new religion that he forgot to be a good pharaoh, Quite a lot of the empire he inherited rebelled, and the people in his new capital seem to have had severe health problems through a diet of nothing but beer and bread. When Akhenaten ceased to be, it was left to his son, Tutankhaten. Like all of Egypt, he wasn't too impressed with his dad's new faith, so he changed the Aten at the end of his name to Amun, hence Tutankhamun. Teenage Tut even wrote his own version of "Oh God, I hate you" into stone, writing it on a stela at Karnak. Tut reinstated the old gods and went back to Cairo. Then at some point around 1323 BCE, when he was roughly 18 years old, he passed away violently. No one knows precisely what happened, but huge chunks of his ribs and some of his vertebrae and sternum are all missing, and there's a massive gash down his front. One theory is that he was killed in a chariot accident. However it happened, according to Egyptologist Salima Ikram, whoever mummified him wanted to drive home the religious change by turning Tut into Osiris, the god of the afterlife. They did this, Salima claims, by using a dye to make his skin dark black, like Osiris's, placing him in his now famous headgear that was filled with bandages that some think were a nod to Osiris's white crown. And even though it was customary to remove the heart, they hadn't put a scarab in its place like they usually would. The thinking is that he wouldn't need his heart to get into the afterlife if the people in the afterlife thought he was the boss. There's also a diagonal cut across his body. The belief is they were trying to mimic how Osiris looked after his brother Seth cut him up. And because of this gash, they didn't need much help getting his innards out. But they aren't the grossest part. This is the gross part. You might not be able to tell from that image, but they decided to mummify his gentleman's vegetable in a 19-degree upright position. Tut was buried with his manservant standing to attention. The only small problem, pun intended, is that not long after Howard Carter found Tut, they accidentally knocked it off. Then, they lost it. Then, they found it. Those who have examined the body think Howard was telling the truth about the upright soldier, and some believe it was done to represent Osiris's powers of fertility. But if you think the way they treated their king's member after he passed on was gross, wait until you find out what happened to them when people were alive. As I mentioned earlier, our friend Iri would occasionally have to help his pharaoh when he went for a pee, especially when he was on his time of the month. The ancient Egyptians thought women and men could have a time of the month. It made sense. Women produce liquid down below, men produce liquid down below. Sometimes women's liquid is clear, sometimes it's red. And it's the same with men. I know, right? What do you mean men's pee is occasionally red? Some Egyptologists believe that ancient Egyptian men thought that they sometimes had a red wee, and that was perfectly natural and normal and part of the bodily cycle that both sexes went through. In 1937, a parasite expert called J.A. Scott, and I'm sure you can see where this is going, found out that so many Egyptian men, even as late as the early 20th century, had crimson pee because they'd gone too close to the River Nile. And living in the River Nile is this. A type of flatworm called Schistosomiasis hematobium that gets carried around by snails in the Nile and then get into the human body and set up a home in the liver to lay eggs. Doing that causes quite a lot of blood to appear in your pee and a disease sometimes called snail fever. To be fair, the ancient Egyptians didn't always think it was a male period. 5 of the 10 Egyptian medical texts we have something called written as 2 vultures. That might well be the same disease, though some think it could just be talking about anything coming out of a man's junk. You might remember that was part of Iri's title. Others think peeing blood was so common that ancient Egyptians thought it was natural, just a male time to complement the female time. So, what do you think is the grossest out of these 5? Have you heard something worse? If so, let me know below. If you like this video, you can use a button nearby to prove that, and it'd be great if you'd subscribe to get more gross and horrifying stories and countdowns from history every Sunday and Wednesday. I'm trying to get to my first 10,000 subs, unless I've managed that by the time you watch this, in which case I'm trying for my first 50, 100 million, whatever. I can dream, can't I? Anyway, I'll be over the moon for getting your support no matter what. If you like this and want to support me even more for just $5 a month, you can go to my Patreon, where you'll get early access to videos, extra videos that go a bit more into the science and psychology and history, your name's in the credits, and a chance to join a monthly live stream where we can discuss the grossest things that have ever happened to you. And I can prove I'm not an AI bot sent out by our future robot overlords to weird you out. The link is in the top corner and below. And also around here is another link to another horrifyingly gross story from history. Check it out and stay gross, everyone. Gross is good.